Hello, mansplaining listeners. Quick note on this episode. Originally in his treatment, Joe included a segment on the history of predictive policing and the stop and frisk policy in New York City. It's good stuff, but we thought it was maybe a little bit too much for this episode. If you would like to hear it, you can find that segment after our close music. It's about 7.5 minutes long and good stuff. So, with no further ado, let's get on with the episode. Welcome to Mansplaining, a podcast about the interesting things and unexpected discoveries you can make if you just take the time to learn. I'm Mark, your host for this week, and as always, I'm joined by Joe, an old friend from college. Together, we'll explore what's on our minds and hopefully figure out a thing or two about a thing or two. So I was reading this week, Joe, that the Omicron peak in Seattle has already passed, and I'm starting to dream of better days when things are getting a little bit back to normal. Is that part of your reality too?
Oh, absolutely. Yes. Same thing here in New York. And in fact, I was so bold as to reschedule my indoor volleyball group for this Sunday. It's the first time we'll be playing since the middle of December, and I'm excited about it.
Yeah, I know how you feel about volleyball. It's something very important to you.
Yeah. Well, being able to do something indoors with people is important to me too. So yeah, we're going to start again.
Well, fingers crossed that you have a good experience.
Thank you.
So this week we're dealing with something which has been bugging me for a while, which is you will hear from many sources that crime statistics have been on the decline since a peak that I think was in the 1970s. And that anyone who tells you otherwise, be it a host on Fox News or a law and order politician who says crime is out of control, those people are just trying to scare you. But then I read an article which did kind of scare me in a way, which is that it was on the history of data-based police work, where police departments were learning to take crime statistics into account in the way that they did their police work, and that one of the outcomes of that was a perverse incentive in which police chiefs and police departments were underreporting crime in order to hit the numbers that they had set for themselves or that their community had set for them. And so that really posed the question for me. When we hear that crime rates are declining year over year, is that because crime is actually declining year over year? Or is it because police departments are just reporting less and less crime in order to hit their numbers? And so my question for you, Joe, was who is it who's gathering and reporting these crime statistics? And to what extent should we be trusting them? So what did you find?
Thank you for the question, Mark. And thanks also for sharing the article that got you thinking about this. It's from New York Magazine. It's really a fascinating glimpse into what New York City did in terms of digitizing its crime data. And I'm going to spend some time talking about that as part of my response. But I want to start with the easier of your two questions, which is who's gathering and reporting crime statistics. They're gathered by exactly who you'd think would gather them: local and state police departments, county sheriff's offices, probation departments, and court administrators. Mm-hmm. As for who reports the statistics, I've activated our acronym alert klaxon, as you just heard, Mark. That's our early warning system that acronyms are incoming, so brace yourself.
Okay, consider me braced.
All right. So crime statistics are reported by the federal government using two statistical programs developed by the U.S. Department of Justice, the DOJ. One is maintained by the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the FBI, via its Uniform Crime Reporting Program, or UCR, which started in 1930 and compiles monthly data received from about 20,000 federal, state, and local agencies on quote-unquote major crimes like murder, manslaughter, rape, robbery, assault, burglary, grand larceny, car theft, arson, and human trafficking, plus arrest data for 22 other crime categories. So when Hillary Clinton and George Soros traffic innocent children to pedophiles after drinking their blood, the UCR is the database that records that activity.
Okay, good to know.
And if anyone in our audience doesn't get that reference, listen to Mansplaining episode number 4.
Increasingly, it's a truth that listeners can count on, that everything you need to know is accounted for in some episode of Mansplaining.
Yeah.
We are increasingly referencing ourselves as we go forward.
Yes, it's true. Now, interestingly, the reporting of local crime data to the FBI is not mandatory, but most agencies comply. According to a flyer issued by the DOJ, FBI analysts using the UCR's reporting mechanism, the National Incident-Based Reporting System, or NIBRS, these analysts thoroughly vet all the crime data for, quote, reasonableness, accuracy, and deviations that may indicate errors, end quote. Put a pin in that for now. I'm going to get back to that when I discuss the reliability of crime statistics at the end. The result of all this is a publication produced in the spring of the following calendar year called Crime in the United States that aggregates all the vetted crime counts nationally and by region, state, county, city, town, tribe, and even by individual college and university campus.
Wait a minute, tribe? Tribe, is that for like Native American reservations?
Correct.
Or is that a different classification? Oh, okay.
That's for reservations, exactly. There are even additional crosstabs describing the perpetrators and victims, their ages, sex, race, weapons used, etc. This publication is shared with all the law enforcement entities that contributed to it, and a version is also posted online for the public. Now, the other national crime reporting program is the Bureau of Justice Statistics National Crime Victimization Survey, or NCVS, which started as the National Crime Survey in 1973 and was renamed in 1992. The NCVS focuses on crime incidents, victims, and trends by collecting detailed information on the nature and frequency of crimes like rape and sexual assault, aggravated and simple assault, robbery, burglary, and other types of theft. DOJ gets this super granular info by interviewing more than 150,000 Americans aged 12 and over each year about the crimes they've experienced in the prior 6 months, whether or not those crimes were even reported to law enforcement. NCVS also collects information about why crimes are or aren't reported, including the experiences of crime victims in dealing with the criminal justice system.
Right, right. As you say that, it occurs to me that rape statistics could not possibly be accurate within a period or a community where the woman doesn't feel like she's free to come forward and report the crime.
Yes, interestingly, rape statistics are the most confusing ones to look at in these analyses for the reason you just said, but also because it used to be only the forcible rape of women that was considered in the rape statistics. And now that category is broadened greatly, which I think is a good thing, but it kind of skews the historical data. NCVS's annual publications include a report called Criminal Victimization, an online database called the Victimization Analysis Tool, and special reports on topics like school crime, identity theft, hate crime, intimate partner violence, and workplace violence. Though there's a lot of overlap between the two programs, they complement each other by serving different purposes. The UCR measures crimes reported to law enforcement agencies around the country. Its primary goal is to provide reliable statistics for further analysis by those agencies at every level. The NCVS is the primary source for information about the characteristics of criminal victimization and the number and types of crimes that are not reported to law enforcement authorities. Together, the UCR and NCVS give us a better, more three-dimensional understanding of crime trends in the USA than either could give us alone.
Mm-hmm.
All right, that wasn't too many acronyms, was it?
It just feels like the appropriate number of acronyms, so
Yeah.
I'll give you credit for that.
Okay, good. So I thought about using more of them, but that would have been TMI. It's not surprising that big data hardware and techniques are now being used to tally crime statistics. At least a half dozen prior episodes of this podcast have touched on how data collection is used in subjects as far-flung as charting political trends, developing autonomous drones and cars, and for music streaming.
Mm-hmm.
Baseball statistics have used big data for decades, so why not crime statistics?
Right.
Before we pivot to your second question, which is the toughie about the reliability of crime statistics, I think it's instructive to drill down on the experience in New York City, whose pioneering CompStat system was the granddaddy of data collection efforts at the local level. We can thank Rudy Giuliani's first police commissioner and a so-called cave cop working on subway crime for the data revolution in policing. Before the 1990s, the NYPD had compiled crime stats only once every 6 months. That's hard to believe.
Yeah.
And cops were promoted mostly based on seniority rather than whether they improved public safety. Getting the rank and file to believe it could prevent crime instead of merely reacting to it or putting a lid on it was the main impetus for the installation of CompStat, which is short for computer statistics. It triggered what one consultant called a massive culture change in policing. The CompStat origin story traces its genesis to April 6, 1994, which was the first date that NYPD precinct commanders converged on police headquarters to be grilled by their superiors on the crime numbers in their precincts. Commanders soon started compiling their numbers on a daily basis and transmitting them to headquarters, where they were ingested into a computer and analyzed. CompStat have 4 initial goals as outlined by its creator, a forward-thinking NYC transit cop named Jack Maple. 1, accurate, timely intelligence. 2, rapid deployment. 3, effective tactics. And 4, relentless follow-up and assessment. When Mayor Giuliani's first police commissioner, William Bratton, came aboard in 1994, one of his first hires was Jack Maple. The synthesis of Maple's concepts with Bratton's systems formed the basis of CompStat. In Bratton's view, CompStat brought accountability to the NYPD. I quote, "It was hated by managers and cops alike for the fact that they are being held accountable when for 20 years prior they hadn't been." End quote.
Yeah.
Precinct captains were regularly trotted into high-pressure meetings where they were presented with granular data from their precincts and asked to defend their decisions about force allocation and tactics. Criminologists who studied CompStat concluded that higher arrest rates were not nearly as important to the program's success as was its insistence that precinct commanders be held responsible for the criminal activity taking place in their precincts.
Yeah, at the very least, I'd say that one contribution of the program is just having that dialogue, like just having that period of reflection where you're thinking about what you did and asking whether or not it was the right choice. It seems like that's a necessary ingredient to learning and getting better on the job.
Yeah, and I was thinking, boy, I'd love to be a fly on the wall in some of those conversations. And then it occurred to me, I've actually seen them dramatized on television. When I watched The Wire, in particular, I remember seeing dramatization of this kind of CompStat meeting, except the Baltimore version of it.
Yeah.
NYU sociologist Patrick Sharkey wrote in a recent book that, quote, "The more directed and precise policing is, targeting places and people that count for a disproportionate share of violence, we have good and clear evidence it reduces crime. In New York, policing was disorganized and scattershot before the emergence of CompStat." End quote. After the launch of CompStat, major felonies dropped by 39% in 27 months.
Wow.
Yeah, that is a significant drop. And that news was greeted as proof of concept of the new approach. crime continued to decline steadily for the next 25 years. A Manhattan Institute study of the program in December 2001 called it, quote, perhaps the single most important organizational/administrative innovation in policing during the latter half of the 20th century, end quote. Success like that breeds imitation, and jurisdictions all over the world have implemented the technology. London and Paris use a form of it, as does L.A. Today, most police departments in America use CompStat or one of its knockoffs, like BlightStat in New Orleans or CityStat in Baltimore. The downward trajectory of New York City crime statistics is truly remarkable. Here are the isolated raw numbers for 2 violent crimes, murder and rape, and 2 property crimes, burglary and vehicle theft. Now, these are New York City numbers. Murder. There were 2,262 in 1990 and 290 in 2017,
Wow.
which was the lowest number in nearly 70 years.
Wow. And was the population sort of consistent over that period, or is that an even bigger drop per capita?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't have that information at hand, but I do know from being a New York City resident that the population of New York City has been relatively stable in the last few decades.
Okay.
The murder rate, to be sure, has gone up again from 290 in 2017 to 488 in 2021. I'm going to ask that we put a pin in that as well. I'm going to say more about the recent rise in crime in a minute. But for now, I just want to bring your attention to the overall net decrease of 78.4% in the 31 years between 1990 and 2021. I want to talk about rape now. 3,126 in 1990 and 1,491 in 2021. Which is an overall net decrease of 52.3%.
Right.
Burglary, 122,055 in 1990, down to 12,811 in 2021, an overall net decrease of 89.5%.
Wow.
And last of my samples, vehicle theft, 146,925 in 1990, down to 10,415 in 2021, which is an overall net decrease of 92.9%.
That's remarkable.
It is remarkable. These declines are consistent even outside major felonies. The grand total of misdemeanor offenses dropped by more than 50% between 2000 and 2020, while violations like disorderly conduct or marijuana possession were down nearly 40% over the same period.
Yeah. And actually, if we cast the net a little bit further back from that, what I'm thinking about right now is sort of the pop culture perception of New York City in movies, for instance, in the 1970s, and also a little bit in the 1980s, where it was basically presented as a cesspool that was beyond redemption.
Yes.
And you had movies like Death Wish with Charles Bronson coming out, where it was presented as crime completely out of control, and a citizen's only proper response to that is to buy a gun and start killing criminals.
Yes.
And that sort of speaks to the level of despair that existed in decades prior to today, when, people are complaining about a rise in crime, but no one is talking about how crime has taken control of the city, the way it seemed to be the assumption like 50 years ago.
Right, and if you consider culture to be a reflection on the society, then that was certainly a reflection on the despair that people felt about it. And there were so many movies of that ilk. I'm thinking of The Taking of Pelham 1, 2, 3,
right.
The Warriors,
yes,
The Panic in Needle Park, with a young Al Pacino, by the way. There were so many movies like that, all centered in New York City.
Right.
And what's more, these numbers roughly parallel what's going on nationally. I looked at the raw numbers of crimes by category nationally over the 60-year period from 1960 to 2019, and crime is down significantly from the bad old days of the 1980s and 90s. The national crime rate, and this is the per 100,000 people, which controls for population growth, like you were asking a minute ago. That national crime rate peaked in 1991 and has been steadily declining ever since. The murder rate nationally today is about the same as it was in 1960. Now, despite all the ballyhoo about CompStat and its many knockoffs, there is far from a consensus about what led to the significant decline in crime since the 1990s. Most independent experts attribute the nationwide lowering of crime rates in the USA in the 1990s and 2000s to a range of factors, of which digitized crime data is but one. Here are some others. Academics have argued that things like the elimination of neurotoxic lead paint and leaded gasoline, or the increase in abortions, were major factors in urban crime reduction. Rick Rosenfeld, a professor of criminology at the University of Missouri, St. Louis, told New York Magazine that, quote, 2 decades of an expanding economy and mass incarceration have contributed the most to the crime drop, end quote. Municipal leaders in Phoenix and Houston credited mostly community policing initiatives and economic development. Others credit factors like gentrification, the end of the boom in crack cocaine, or the addition of hundreds of thousands of cops to the streets during the Bill Clinton presidency in the 1990s. It's probably all of these things and more.
Yeah.
As an Atlantic magazine article on crime statistics put it, quote, criminologists sometimes describe crime as a chaotic system, and countless factors contribute to it, end quote.
Right. My general principle is when anyone is arguing that a single factor is the producer of a complex system, that's an oversimplification to the point of distortion. It's always many, many things.
Yeah. As I referenced earlier when I was reading the New York City raw numbers, there has unquestionably been a spike in the murder rate since 2019. Homicides jumped by 25% from 2019 to 2020, the largest single-year gain since national statistics were first maintained. Several U.S. cities reached all-time highs, although the rise was not limited to urban areas. And for those who think this is happening only in areas of the country run by permissive Democrats, not true. The higher murder rate persisted into 2021, though at a slower pace than in 2020. We won't have complete numbers for 2021 until later this year. Despite the surge in homicides and a few other violent crimes, the overall number of major felonies was down about 5%, including most property crimes. Though it's not directly related to your question, Mark, I want to pause here to consider possible reasons for the recent surge in crimes like murder, since it's obviously on a lot of people's minds right now. First, let's consider the obvious. The uptick roughly coincides with the emergence of COVID-19 in our country. There's been a sharp increase in gun purchases, which spiked during the pandemic. In the 9 months after the pandemic started in March 2020, Americans purchased 19 million firearms, which was 3 million more than were purchased in any of the prior 10 full years.
Wow.
Of course, shootings soared in 2020. Duh. 77% of homicides in 2020 were caused by firearms, the highest percentage ever recorded, and non-fatal shootings also spiked. Much like how most economists see rising inflation as a pandemic-related phenomenon that will ease as the virus slowly recedes, I think the same about the recent rise in some types of crime. It's important for us not to get hysterical about the uptick in crime and to put it in historical perspective. So I'm going to do that for you right now. For example, even though the homicide numbers have increased noticeably in the last 2 full years since 2019, they remain about 40% lower than they were at their peak, which occurred when you and I were young adults in the 1980s and 1990s. So you mentioned the 1970s earlier. It's actually the 80s and 90s when crime was at its peak. Social science researchers have already determined that unemployment, economic disparity, and physical distancing exacerbated by the pandemic are among the most reliable predictors of increased violence. Add to that the desperation caused by the steep rise in unemployment, exacerbated by existing economic disparities, which affected millions of Americans in 2020. The pandemic-related lockdowns, quarantines, and physical distancing adversely affected the outreach programs that help underprivileged communities to avoid violence. And finally, the fallout from the killings of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, and others, and the nationwide social justice protests that ensued, may have also been a factor, whether through diminished respect or outright hostility for the police, or through the Ferguson effect, which refers to the pullback by demoralized police from some aspects of their crime prevention duties in the face of increased criticism from the community.
Yeah. I've certainly seen an alienation between the Seattle Police Department and the Seattle community, where they just seem very polarized from each other. And it's a deep concern for me as someone living in this community that the heavily armed force that is charged with protecting this community does not seem to feel like it is on the same page with what the community values.
Right.
And yeah, as a citizen, I would feel less protected by the police, less likely to call the police, less likely to respect the police as a leader in a crisis situation. And I can only imagine, like I'm speaking as a middle-class white man, I cannot imagine just how much worse it would be for a young black man, for instance, in St. Louis or New York or Chicago or LA. Like, if it's that bad for me, it's got to be so much worse for a person of color.
Yeah, agreed. And I think millions of people agree with what you just said, not just me. And criminologists are crunching the numbers on the potential Ferguson effect to confirm whether it's real or not. But I think it's just human nature, if the cops are hated or distrusted by the community, kind of retrench their efforts and not be that domineering presence that they were a couple decades ago when crime was crashing downward.
Right. And I'm also thinking about the efforts that police leaders, at least in New York and probably elsewhere, are making towards greater community engagement. You cannot engage with a community that is suspicious and fearful of you.
Absolutely.
Like, just as a basic requirement, people have to feel safe around you. And I don't know about you, but the last time I was in a restaurant and I looked over and I saw a table full of cops and they all had their firearms on their hips, I did not feel safe in that context.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's why I'm kind of hopeful that New York City's new mayor, Eric Adams, a former cop himself who agitated against the hyper-aggressive police department, I'm hoping he can strike the right balance between public safety and social justice.
Yeah.
That's a tall order for him to fill. But I mention all this stuff, Mark, really to throw cold water on the hysteria fomented by many hyperventilators in the media, often supported by man-in-the-street interviews, that crime is spiraling out of control right now. The truth is that the public perception of crime never matches crime statistics.
Sure.
Opinion polls regularly find that Americans think crime is up nationally, despite the data showing it is down. For example, 57% of registered voters surveyed by Pew in 2016 said that crime had gotten worse since 2008, even though the UCR and UCVS data shows double-digit declines in violent and property crime during that time span. And even more to the point, I remember what it was like to live in New York City in 1990. I witnessed an armed robbery that year in the Chinese Laundry next door to my apartment building. My wife was mugged a few blocks from her apartment around the same time. I can tell you with 100% conviction that New York is not that city anymore.
Yeah, my sister lived in Hell's Kitchen in right around 1988, 89, right around there. And
yeah.
I visited her there a few times, and I felt like I was taking my life in my hands walking into and out of her apartment building.
Yep. well, those were the bad old days for sure. Okay, it's time to grapple with the question of whether all these crime statistics are reliable. Once again, I'm going to use New York City as the example of a phenomenon happening all over the country. Pre-pandemic, there was a steady stream of reporting in the local media from New York Police Department whistleblowers that some commanders were misclassifying major felonies as misdemeanors to hold down crime statistics in their precincts, and in so doing, further their careers.
Yeah.
At least 2 investigations in 2010 and 2013 confirmed that some number fudging was happening. Former NYPD captain and Compstat critic Johnny Turno called the practice of downgrading crimes absolutely unconscionable, adding that, quote, the numbers are being gamed, plain and simple, and the numbers are being gamed because the commanders are under tremendous pressure to make the numbers look good, end quote. Such reports were met with significant pushback from the NYPD, which acknowledged that while a handful of commanders had been disciplined for manipulating statistics, the overall error rate in its annual crime reporting was just 2% out of 700,000 total incident reports. The NYPD, like most other large police departments, takes steps to review the accuracy of its crime reporting. According to the New York Daily News, those steps include, quote, investigating complaints, precinct-level audits of the numbers twice a year, and the use of a sophisticated algorithm that looks for anomalies, end quote. I should also note that in recent years, there are nearly as many reports of police departments over-reporting crimes, upcharging certain offenses like car thefts, and creating mythical crime spikes to discourage momentum for criminal justice reform measures like bail reform, or to push a false narrative that bail reform is responsible for more crime.
Yeah.
So, of course, we shouldn't be surprised to hear that underreporting or downgrading of crime might happen, given the perverse incentives that stem from an over-reliance on tools like Compstat. But despite the credible claims of manipulation, I still find it hard to believe that local crime stats can be fudged so egregiously as to meaningfully obscure the national numbers and make them say things that just aren't true. At the local level, precinct numbers are microanalyzed in the ways I just described, but they also need to pass the sniff test of those rigorous weekly Compstat meetings, which are now happening all over the country. Commanders can't hide the crimes being committed in their neighborhoods the way they used to. And at the national level, remember what I said at the beginning about how the FBI was vetting raw crime data for reasonableness, accuracy, and deviations? FBI criminologists and statisticians carefully review local data to check for variations that may indicate modified or incomplete reporting or other changes from year to year. The DOJ claims that, quote, to identify any unusual fluctuations in an agency's crime counts, the program compares monthly reports to previous submissions of the agency and with those for similar agencies. End quote.
Okay, so they're smoothing out the curve, essentially.
Yeah, and call me naive, Mark, but if reports like the UCR and NCVS say that nearly all forms of crime were steadily decreasing for years prior to the pandemic, I believe them.
Mm-hmm. And it is comforting in a way that we have some departments magnifying crime stats and other departments possibly minimizing crime stats because they will cancel each other out.
Yeah, it's a wash in the end. Yeah, good point. But don't just take my word for it. Lee Laughlin, an expert on police matters, wrote that the fudging of crime numbers happens, especially during election years, but that, quote, falsifying these numbers is a rarity, not the norm, end quote. And consider this. If precinct commanders all over America were fudging their data for nearly 30 consecutive years to keep crime numbers artificially low prior to 2020, then why wouldn't they have continued doing so over the last 2 years when crime numbers have ticked up again?
Yeah, good point.
I just don't see a persuasive case for chronic underreporting. The numbers are what they are. Sometimes a rose is just a rose.
Okay.
So I'm therefore reasonably confident that the crime statistics spit out by the UCR, NCVS, CompStat, and their brethren are accurately telling us what's going on. I'm not as confident about this as I am about Barry Bonds belonging in the Baseball Hall of Fame, but I'm confident nonetheless. Have I convinced you, Mark?
I feel quite a bit better about the crime stats. So I would say, yes, you have convinced me. That's like, as with all stats, there's going to be some gray areas. And, as with a stat like rape, where the victims themselves might be reluctant to report what happened, we should definitely look at those with a skeptical eye.
Yes.
And
agreed.
like when you're going through the reductions in rates of crime, and you were talking about some stats that have dropped by 80 or 90%, and I believe that rape had dropped by about 30%. My first question is, maybe rape was just radically underreported in early years, and it also might have reduced by a much greater extent, but we're never going to know.
Yes.
Because that's just speculation, because we have to be suspicious of those numbers.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. And I really love the point you brought up about the movies, too, because I keep thinking about that, how, not that films are the same things as statistics, of course, but they are a good barometer of what a culture is wrestling with and what culture considers to be priorities. And so many of those films in the 70s and 80s, not just in New York, but everywhere in the country, were about, out of control violence.
Yeah.
And there aren't movies like that today,
Right.
And that itself is kind of a barometer of that we're in a better place. So I'm really wanted to push back strongly against the people who think we're entering the bad old days again. It's not true.
Yeah.
It's just not true.
Okay, thank you. Do you have a question for me for next time?
I do, yes. I want to keep things light and breezy for our next episode, Mark.
Okay.
Civil War.
Okay. That'll be fun.
All right?
That'll be fun.
There's been some polling and media noise recently about whether the United States is heading down the grim path toward a second civil war.
Right.
There's not one but two new books about this subject that are generating a lot of buzz right now. I'd like you to investigate this for me and come back with your considered opinion on these two questions. Number one, how likely are we to see a civil war in the near future?
Mm-hmm.
And number two, without a clear north-south fault line as there was in 1860, what would a second civil war even look like?
Right. Interesting question, and I will let you know what I've decided 2 weeks from now. So that's it for this week. If you have any thoughts on this episode or would like to leave comments on previous episodes, please come by our Facebook page, which you can find at Mansplaining Podcast. Come by, give a like to our page if you haven't already. Leave a few comments on an episode. We'd love to get comments. Or you could pose a question, and we will try to answer it in a future episode. If you'd like to help other people discover this podcast, the very best way you can do that, aside from word of mouth and shouting it at them in the subway, is to leave a rating and a review on a podcast service. So that could be Spotify or iTunes or wherever it is that you get your podcasts.
But I just want to say it's okay to shout at people in the subway as long as you're properly masked.
Yes. In fact, we encourage it with proper masking. In fact, you need to shout with a mask because otherwise people won't understand what you're saying. But mask up and then yell at the top of your voice.
Yes.
That's it for this week. I'm Mark. That was Joe. And thank you for spending some time with us.
Talk to you next time.
That's it for this edition of Mansplaining. Mansplaining is brought to you by Joe and Mark and nobody else. Thank you for hanging out with us for a little bit, and we'll see you next time.
The implementation of CompStat also helped usher into practice a new theory of policing called broken windows that had first been proposed in the pages of The Atlantic magazine in 1982. It maintained that ignoring small violations of the law like turnstile jumping on the subways or quality of life offenses like the eponymous broken window led to more serious crimes and the growth of disorder, because the folks who jump turnstiles or break windows often have outstanding warrants for other crimes. Arresting the turnstile jumper, therefore, leads to a decrease in robberies and assaults. Broken windows led to a huge uptick in arrests, with misdemeanor arrests, mostly for drugs, jumping above 80,000 by the 2000s, and the number of New York City residents in New York State prisons skyrocketing to more than 47,000 at the start of Mayor Giuliani's second term in 1998, before gradually declining to 23,000 by 2016 under Mayor de Blasio. Interestingly, one thing that wasn't quantified by CompStat was the number of New Yorkers stopped and frisked by the newly emboldened police. Police Commissioner Bratton claimed that that was intentional so as not to encourage precinct commanders to push for more and more stops. But other police personnel called that revisionist history, insisting that the numbers simply weren't collected. Regardless, a lawsuit after the fatal shooting of Amadou Diallo in 1999 forced the NYPD to start tracking stops right around the time that Mike Bloomberg became mayor in the 2000s, the early 2000s. What the new tracking showed was stops skyrocketing from 97,296 in 2002 to 685,724 in 2011, 9 years later. Incidentally, New York City now refers to stop and frisk as stop, question, and frisk, which strikes me as an attempt to apply a patina of justification to an unevenly applied, outright racist policy of harassing young black and brown men.
Yeah, particularly if the question stage of that process always results in a frisking, then it doesn't matter what the answer to the question is. And so if it's racist at the beginning, it's racist at the end.
Yeah, you got it. The cause of that spike in stop and frisk is still hotly debated, but criminologist and retired NYPD captain John Eterno attributes it to precincts trying to outdo their prior numbers each successive year. Now I'm going to quote Eterno. There was enormous pressure on the captains to meet quotas and cover themselves. If they got questioned about a robbery, they could say, "We did 10 stop and frisks in that area." End quote.
Yeah.
The data-heavy approach to policing did indeed change the behavior of beat cops by institutionalizing an ethic of constant aggressive intervention to achieve the quote-unquote right numbers. As one professor of criminal justice put it, police leaders began to assume, quote, that if cops reduced their activity, then crime would go up, end quote.
Yeah. There's a saying in my line of work, which is be careful what you measure, because almost the inevitable outcome is you start managing towards the measurement.
Yeah.
And the measurement doesn't always align with what you want the outcome to be. So you need to be super careful about, first off, what you're measuring and then how you're applying that measurement. Because if at the end of the day all you're doing is trying to improve your numbers, you might be improving the numbers, but you're not actually reaching the goals that everybody else wants you to be working towards.
Right. And I believe that's what William Bratton thought, or that's his justification for why he didn't initially have stop and frisk as a measurable metric, though they were measuring practically everything else.
Yeah.
But regardless of its cause, stop and frisk was a broad brush tactic in a department that supposedly revered precision. 85% of the stops were of blacks and Latinos, and 80% were of innocent people. Bloomberg's top cop, Ray Kelly, adamantly maintained that race was not a factor in who got stopped. The NYPD simply followed CompStat numbers by sending cops to high crime areas, which happened to be in poorer neighborhoods where both the perpetrators and the victims were mostly people of color.
Mm-hmm.
But Kelly's argument didn't win the day. A lawsuit was filed and a federal judge ruled in 2013 that the city's stop and frisk program amounted to a, quote, policy of indirect racial profiling, end quote. and was therefore unconstitutional in its application. Though the Bloomberg administration appealed the decision, his successor, Mayor de Blasio, who campaigned for office on a tagline that life in New York City had become a tale of two cities, later dropped the appeal. The liberal de Blasio reinstalled one of the architects of CompStat, William Bratton, as his police commissioner in 2014, but Bratton's mission had changed from the 1990s. He was now expected to keep crime low and establish a friendlier climate between the NYPD and the citizens of New York City. As a result, stop and frisk arrests plunged from their high water mark of nearly 700,000 under Bloomberg and Kelly in 2011 to less than 12,500 in 2016 under de Blasio and Bratton. New metrics were now prioritized, such as the quality rather than the quantity of law enforcement activity. Bratton, fresh off a stint as LA's police commissioner, brought a new technique back to New York City with him called predictive policing, in which AI-based algorithms predict which neighborhoods and times of day are likely to experience a particular type of crime, so that commanders could send cops flooding into that area as a preemptive strike against the anticipated crime. NYPD also developed a profile of the approximately 5,000 quote-unquote prolific criminals whom they believe are responsible for the lion's share of violence in the city. New York City even spun off CompStat into a new program called Neighborhood Stat that aggregated data for other municipal services like sanitation, housing, and community groups so they could work with the police to craft local crime prevention strategies. Prior to COVID-19's arrival, there was a real hope that with the seemingly stable, long-term drop in crime, police departments in New York City and around the country could focus more attention on improving community relations.
Yeah. Predictive police work makes me think of the movie Minority Report. Have you seen that one with Tom Cruise?
Yes, I sure have. That was a memorable movie.
It was, but the concept gets a lot of bad press. I think people are deeply uncomfortable with the idea of a machine learning algorithm predicting where crime is going to be before the crime has been committed. We're much more comfortable with the notion that we wait for someone to do something wrong before we send the cops in.
Yes.